Hello everybody. Today we're going to continue our exploration of cells. And so thus far with cells, we've talked about the classification of cells and classifying cells as either prokaryotic or eukaryotic. We then took a look at eukaryotic cells and divided them into plant and animal cells and have looked at the organelles that make up each of those cells and looked at the structure and the function of those organelles. Now we're going to take a deeper look at those cells, and we're going to take a look at what makes up each of those components of a cell. And so those are something called macromolecules. And so there are two major concepts that we're really going to focus on as we look at macromolecules today. The first concept is that there are four major macromolecules that are essential for life. And so those four that we're going to explore today are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, all of which I think you've heard of before, but we're going to take a deep dive into exactly what they do for the cell. Okay, and then the second concept is that all four of those macromolecules are made up of monomers and polymers. And so each of those macromolecules are polymers. So we're going to dive into exactly what that means. Okay, so when we're talking about macromolecules, we're looking at parts of the cell on a very microscopic level. And so some key terms that we need to understand. Well, one, we need to understand what a macromolecule is. And so when we look at the term macromolecule, we're going to break it into two sections. So the prefix macro means large, and then we have molecule. So really when we're talking about parts of the cell are made up of macromolecules, we're saying that they're made up of large molecules. When we are talking about macromolecules, we're always going to have a monomer. Okay, so a monomer, once again, we're going to break that up into a prefix and then its unit. Okay, and so the prefix mono means one, and mer is unit. So a monomer is one unit. So if you look at the image off to the right, and I have the structure of a monomer, you see three circles there, two of which are white and one that is black. That whole structure is just one molecule, okay? So it's an individual molecule. Once we start to bond those monomers together, now we start to form polymers. And so a polymer, we're going to break it up once again. Our prefix is poly, means many, and mer is still unit. So a polymer is many units. And so when we look at the bottom, we have that three circle structure show up four times, right? So we have four of those monomers bound together to form my polymer. And it's really important that we understand that every macromolecule is a polymer. So it's made up of monomers that have been bonded together. Okay. So the first of the macromolecules that I want to take a look at are carbohydrates. And I know all of you have heard of carbohydrates, right? We know that carbohydrates would be like your breads, your pastas, things of that nature. Carbohydrates are one of those macromolecules that really get a bad rap. When people start to go on diets, it's usually one of the first things they cut out of their diet, and that's really not a very good thing. Your body needs carbohydrates. Now, like everything else, it needs carbohydrates, and it needs them on like a schedule. Too much of anything can be a bad thing, and so carbohydrates also falls into that category. Okay, so when we think about carbohydrates are sugars. Okay, and so that's the big thing that we need to understand. Carbohydrates are sugars, and so carbohydrates are made up of the monomer saccharide, and saccharide means sugar. So when we are talking about the monomer of a carbohydrate, we often refer to that as a monosaccharide. Okay, carbohydrates are made up of carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. So when we think about carbo, so carb is the carb, carbon part, the O is oxygen, and then the hydrate is the hydrogen. Okay, so all three of those elements make up our carbohydrates, which once again are sugars. So at the bottom, I have some images for you. So that first image is just a monosaccharide all by itself, right? And then once we start to bond those monosaccharides together, we start to form polysaccharides, and polysaccharides are my polymer. Okay, if you look at that middle image, we have two of them put together. We're going to call that a disaccharide. So all that means is we have two saccharides put together. And so that's a really important type of sugar. And so that's why I'm illustrating here. That would represent sucrose. And sucrose is just table sugar. So that's the formation of the sugar that you would put in the foods that you are eating, okay? The main type of sugar that we're really going to focus on when we talk about carbohydrates is glucose. And so we're going to get a lot of glucose from the plants that we eat, okay? So looking at carbohydrates, they are, from this page, the big thing is that they are sugars, okay? So the next thing that I want to kind of look at are the different forms of carbohydrates and the important polysaccharides that go along with them. So the first one is glycogen. And so glycogen is going to be the type of polysaccharide that we utilize when we store energy in the tissue of our cells, okay? So we utilize this kind of branch system to help us store energy, okay? And so when we're thinking about carbohydrates are a great source of short-term energy. And so we can carbo load. So any athletes out there that are currently listening to this, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The day before a sporting event, whether it's a football game, a basketball game, a swim meet, cross-country meet, track meet, whatever, you may have carbo loaded before, and that means you eat a lot of carbs the night before. Maybe you have a big meal that consists of pasta, maybe some bread of some sort, right? And so the next day you can burn those sugars, and carbohydrates are simple sugars, so we can break them down pretty quickly and pretty easily, and it doesn't take a toll on your body. It doesn't take a toll on your digestive system, doesn't upset your stomach, things of that nature. And this is what we're utilizing. We're utilizing these branches to store energy. The longer the branch, or the more branches we have, the more energy that we have stored there, okay? The second polysaccharide that I want to talk about is one that you guys are kind of familiar with, and it's starch. And starch is the energy that is stored in the tissue of plants. So one of the plants that is really high in starch, right, and that most of us are really accustomed to, especially when we talk about carbohydrates, are potatoes. And so, when people go on diets and they cut out a lot of carbohydrates, they kind of go away from having mashed potatoes or baked potatoes or potatoes in general, right? French fries, things of that nature, because it's a carb, but it is energy for us, okay? And so if you notice, the starch molecule is much different than the glycogen, and so we don't utilize any branches to store this energy, so we can break this down really quick, okay? And then the next polysaccharide, and the final one that I want to talk about for carbohydrates, is something called cellulose. And so cellulose is a major component of the plant cell wall. And if you look at the image down below, it kind of explains itself why. So we have multiple layers here of cellulose. And so because of those multiple layers, it's really a good structural piece to kind of help with that cell wall. Cellulose is really important to animals and thus humans because it's really high in fiber, and so that fiber is really going to help us regulate our digestive system, okay? So when we're talking about carbohydrates, overall, carbohydrates are an essential piece of nutrients for the cell, because it's going to provide simple sugars for the cell, and ultimately it's going to allow us to have energy to be able to perform the functions that we need to. Okay, so that's our first of our 4 macromolecules. Our second macromolecule that we're going to focus on is something called lipids. And so really the big idea for lipids is that we understand that lipids are fats, okay? Fats and oils. So when we talk about lipids, lipids are fat polymers made of glycerol and fatty acids. They are made of long carbon chains with hydrogen atoms bonded to it, and they are hydrophobic. So really what that means, we're going to break that into the prefix and its root word, right? So hydro is water, and phobic is like you have a fear of it, right? So if we're talking about lipids, they are hydrophobic, meaning they repel water. They don't like water. And so lipids are fats and oils. So think about it, right? When you think about oils and water don't mix. Fat and water don't mix. They separate out, right? And so if you think about like salad dressing, if you were thinking about like Italian salad dressing, you can see all of those fats and oils, they always separate. You shake it to mix it back in, but then it'll separate. Very true of all lipids, okay? But once again, lipids are important for the way that cells function and the way that an organism functions. So it's really important that you do have some fats and oils in your diet. There is one major form of lipids that I want to talk to you about, and it's a triglyceride. So triglycerides are formed when 3 lipid polymers called fatty acids attach to a glycerol molecule. So when we're looking at this, our lipid polymer are these like yellow kind of strands, and then our glycerol is the purplish bluish piece on the side. And so when we combine that way, the reason why I want to bring this up is because this is how most of the fats in our daily diet are stored in the body, okay? And so another type of lipid, and this is the one that I really want to focus on for us because this is the biggest kind of function for lipids, okay, is a phospholipid. So we know that we have a cell membrane, whether we're a plant cell or an animal cell. We also know that we have some organelles that have membranes around them as well. And so all of those membranes are going to utilize something called a phospholipid, and we actually have a phospholipid bilayer for all of those membranes. And what that is essentially the second picture over here, okay? And so that phospholipid bilayer is really going to be what protects the cell or the organelle and controls what can enter or exit through that membrane. And so the majority of our membrane is made up of these lipids, okay? The phosphate group is hydrophilic, while the lipids are hydrophobic. So the red parts, kind of the heads, like water, and the tails, they do not. So they're going to kind of repel that water, okay? And then I already talked about that these are what are going to form cell membranes. But another huge function of lipids is this is your long-term energy storage. So carbohydrates are your short-term energy storage, but if you go for a period of time without eating, or you go for a period of time where you're exerting a lot of energy, right, and you don't have time to replenish that energy, you're going to tap into this long-term energy storage. When we tap into this long-term energy storage, that takes a little more energy to do that. That's also going to have a little bit more toll on your body. This can also be a helpful thing for you if you're trying to diet. Kind of intermittent fasting is something that I think about if we're trying to tap into our long-term energy storage, okay? In terms of other types of lipids, we do have some that I don't have on the slide. So another type of lipid will be waxes. And so waxes are very important to different organisms. For example, some birds utilize wax to coat their feathers. It's a natural product that's on their feathers, and it helps them repel water that way. We also, another type of lipid would be natural steroids that you and I utilize in our bodies all the time. So cholesterol and vitamins would be another type of lipid that we are utilizing, okay? So thus far, we've talked about carbohydrates, which are short-term energy storage, and we've talked about lipids, which are really two huge functions for us. They make up well over the majority of our cell membrane, so they're protecting what can enter and exit the cell or an organelle, but they also provide long-term energy storage. Okay, the third of those macromolecules that I want to talk about are proteins. And last standard, when we were talking about ribosomes, and ribosomes make proteins, and the reason why that's so important, I told you we would get to it. Well, now we're to it. Protein is a huge component to an organism. And so when we talk about proteins, once again, we're going to break proteins down to their monomer. Okay. And so when we talk about the monomer of a protein, it's going to be the amino acid. And some of you have seen this phrase amino acid. You've seen it on maybe some supplements if you're an athlete. You've heard it on advertisements, whatever the case may be. If you go to GNC, you see amino acids like everywhere, right? And essentially all that means is protein. And so all amino acids are made from carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen. In general, there are 20 amino acids that are found. There are around 20 amino acids that are found in nature naturally. It depends on the amino acids that we assemble and how they're folded for the protein that's actually built, okay? And so if we do what we did with our other two and we break this down into its monomer and its polymer, a protein's monomer is the amino acid. The polymer is a polypeptide chain, okay? And so essentially an amino acid is like let's say a circle, like a dot, right? And so as we start to bring these dots back to a ribosome, then we start to bond them together. And as we bond them together, we form this chain until we have a finished product. Once we have a finished product, then it's folded and it creates our protein, okay? In terms of exactly why our bodies and our cells really need proteins, proteins allow cells to grow, reproduce, and survive. Without proteins, we wouldn't be able to grow or develop. Proteins have many functions within the cell and body, and please take time, pause this video if you need to, but and replay it if you need to, but we need to understand all of these components of proteins, okay? So first one, proteins really help with motion and support. So proteins are going to make up muscle and cartilage. And so I know most of you understand that proteins help with building muscle. One of the things that many people, if they're trying to bulk up, they're trying to put on weight, they're trying to gain muscle mass, is they load up on protein. Understand that your body and the diet that you're on is all the protein that you really need, okay? I know a lot of people supplement and they add protein to their diet. They have protein shakes or protein bars, things of that nature. A lot of that you are wasting your money on. And so you can kind of tap out or kind of hit your limit with protein, and then essentially you're just wasting your money. So those proteins are really crucial for muscle development and cartilage. And so when we're talking about motion and support, that's really like your skeletal system, right? We have our bones, but our bones are all connected with muscles and tendons and cartilage and all of that. And so to be able to move and to be able to function, we have to have proteins, okay? And if you have protein deficiencies, your muscles aren't going to be as strong, you're going to be weaker, it's going to be harder for you to move, it's going to be harder for you to maybe lift things of that nature, okay? B is for cell transport. And so when we're talking about cell transport, this is that idea of proteins assisting in the cell membrane. So the cell membrane consists of phospholipids, right? And we talked about that in our last macromolecule, but they're also going to utilize proteins. And so sometimes we have molecules that are too big to fit directly across the phospholipid bilayer. And so as a result of that, we're going to use proteins. So one protein that we're going to use would be just kind of like a channel. It's going to be used in something that we call passive transport. So it's going to allow materials to move from a high concentration to a low concentration, but it's going to provide it a little bit of a larger opening. So it's kind of like providing a doorway for a molecule to fit through, okay? If it's just a little bit larger. We're also going to utilize proteins if we want to move materials from a low concentration area to a high concentration area. And in this case, we're going to use protein pumps. And so we utilize proteins to aid and help in that cell membrane, okay? The third part, C here, is for defense. Proteins are going to help generate, create, and allow antibodies to work effectively, okay? And so, as many of you know, antibodies are what we use to prevent diseases or sickness. They're what we're going to utilize to stay healthy. And so having a good source of protein can really help you stay healthy that way. And then our final function that I have for you guys for proteins, and this one is crucial, are enzymes. And so enzymes are going to speed up chemical reactions. So enzymes are what we're going to use to break down materials within the cell. It's what we're going to really use, right? When we talked about lysosomes, we talked about lysosomes having over 40 different types of enzymes in them to help clean up the cell and clean up old, worn out organelles. Enzymes speed up those chemical reactions, and enzymes are going to help us unlock nutrients that the rest of the cell needs, right? We're going to utilize those enzymes to break down those carbohydrates that we talked about in our first macromolecule to give us the energy that we can utilize and form usable forms of energy in the terms of ATP in our mitochondria, okay? So proteins, to recap, proteins are crucial. They help, once again, they help cells grow, reproduce, and survive, which ultimately means they help organisms grow, reproduce, and survive, okay? Our final macromolecule that I want to talk about is, in my opinion, in many opinion, the number one macromolecule, and those are called nucleic acids. And the reason why I'm saying this is the most important of your macromolecules is because without nucleic acids, we wouldn't have anything else. Nucleic acids are your DNA, okay? They are that entire genetic code, and it tells the cell and every component of the cell exactly what to do. It tells the proteins, it's the code that allows the proteins to be made. And so without nucleic acids, nothing else really matters for a cell or an organism, okay? Nucleic acids, we're going to break those down to its monomer as well. So nucleic acid is made up of a nucleotide. And I have an image of a nucleotide at the bottom of this slide. And so a nucleotide is made up of 3 components. And so we have a phosphate group, we have a pentose sugar, so a 5-carbon sugar, and we have a nitrogenous base. And so if you look at the bottom, that circles the phosphate group. In the middle, we have the pentose sugar, and then on the right, in this case, the blue one is the nitrogenous sugar. And so when we're talking about those nitrogenous sugars, we have some options that we're going to use, okay? And it depends on which type of nucleic acid we're talking about. So we have two different forms of a nucleic acid. We have a DNA structure. So DNA is a double helix, and if you look at the top right corner, the one on the right would be an example of DNA. And then and DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. And then we have another form of nucleic acid, which you may not have heard of before, and we're going to spend quite a bit of time on it in the next couple standards, which is called RNA, and that's ribonucleic acid. And so in the top right corner, it's the structure to the left. So really, it's a copy of the DNA, and it's a half a section of it. So it's just one side of that DNA strand, so to speak, okay? When we're talking about nucleic acids, they are the genetic material for life. Those nucleic acids are broken into their nucleotides, and those nitrogenous bases, like I said, we have some options. So if we're talking about DNA, those options for us are adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine. Okay, and so those bases are really important for DNA. And so something that I want to add here for you guys, just so you start to kind of think about it, is that those four bases are going to pair very specifically. So adenine always pairs with thymine, and cytosine always pairs with guanine, okay? And so we'll talk more about that later. If we're talking about RNA, if we're talking about that ribonucleic acid strand, we're going to utilize most of the same bases, okay? So we're still going to utilize adenine, cytosine, and guanine, but instead of using thymine, we're going to use uracil. So we're going to substitute thymine for uracil, okay? So just to recap, we have four major macromolecules. We have carbohydrates. Carbohydrates' main function is short-term energy storage, okay? If we're thinking about the monomer and the polymer of a carbohydrate, the monomer is a monosaccharide. The polymer is a polysaccharide. Our second macromolecule that we talked about were lipids. Lipids are nothing more than fats and oils, okay? The polymer for the monomer for a lipid are glycerol and fatty acids. And then if we're talking about polymers for lipids, examples of that could be phospholipids, or we could even say triglycerides, okay? The functions of lipids are to form the cell membrane, kind of form that protective water repelling barrier around a cell and an organelle. But another function is long-term energy storage, and I guess I could throw another function in there as well. It can serve as protection for an organism, especially if we're talking about like blubber or fats for animals that live in Arctic areas. The third macromolecule that we talked about were proteins, and so the monomer for proteins are amino acids, and then the polymers for those proteins are polypeptide chains, okay? And remember, we have a wealth of functions for proteins. So we have motion and support, cell transport, defense, enzymes, and ultimately proteins help us grow and reproduce and survive, okay? And then finally, to wrap it up, we talked about nucleic acids. We have two types of nucleic acids, DNA and RNA, both of which are made up of monomers called nucleotides. A nucleotide consists of a phosphate group, a 5-carbon sugar, and a nitrogen base, okay? As you have completed this video, you should be filling in your graphic organizer. So at this point, you should have all the information that you need for the graphic organizer. Okay. If you have any questions or concerns, please email me or Zoom with me. I will see you guys in class. Have a great rest of your day.